Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, written a century and a half ago. It's a book that works on three levels. Firstly, it's a novel, a family saga, and if I may say so, a fairly trashy one. Second, it's a history of the Napoleonic Wars insofar as they affected Russia, and especially of Napoleon's march on Moscow in 1812. And third, it's a piece of theoretical history, a theory of how history works, and in this respect it's a point of view I can very much agree with. What Tolstoy says is that the great figures of history, the Julius Caesars, the Napoleons, the Catherine the Greats of this world, have much less effect on human affairs than is usually attributed to them. He calls the impact of these great personages superficial and illusory, arguing that what really drives history is the millions of tiny decisions made by ordinary men and women interacting day to day. He sees the role of the great figures as rhetorical and decorative, not so much shaping events as carried along on the tide of events. Tolstoy calls history the unconscious, universal swarm life of humanity, which uses the lives of rulers for its own purposes. Is this way of looking at things now widely accepted? Not if you go by the history section in most bookshops. It's all Henry VIII's wives, Eleanor of Aquitaine or Louis XIV. The vast mass of people and their humdrum lives barely get a mention alongside these glamorous figures. And if you take something like the Second World War, most people would want to pin the blame on Adolf Hitler as one of the most evil men who ever lived, who not only kicked off the war, but through his disastrous decision-making, hastened Germany's defeat. Few people would say that Hitler's role was superficial and illusory, or that he got carried along on events that were out of his control. Tolstoy lived long before Hitler, of course, but in his day Napoleon played a similar role as the enemy of all mankind. Napoleon was seen as an evil military genius who had caused terrific trouble throughout Europe with his imperialist warmongering, and who had also shaped modern France with a whole raft of reforms and initiatives, such as the Napoleonic Code. So I guess Tolstoy saw Napoleon as a particularly tough test for his theory, and if he could persuade people that even Napoleon's influence was quite superficial, then they would certainly accept his theory more generally. To argue his case about Napoleon, Tolstoy uses the example of the Battle of Borodino. This took place a few days' march from Moscow and was the biggest battle between Napoleon's invading Grand Army and the Russian Imperial Army under Prince Mikhail Kutuzov. The French technically won the battle and went on to capture Moscow, but they only occupied it for a month before beginning their retreat. Tolstoy characterizes Napoleon's army as like a great beast, which was not immediately killed but was mortally wounded by the battle. The beast carried on to Moscow under its own momentum, but inevitably it turned and slouched, its life force ebbing away back to its lair, which it would never reach. Tradition says that of Napoleon's original 700,000 troops, only 20,000 made it home. Tolstoy's point is that Napoleon's victory at Borodino had very little to do with Napoleon himself. By a combination of fictional narrative, actual history, and theoretical discussion, he shows how, by the time information from the field reached the French headquarters, it was already out of date, and by the time Napoleon's new orders returned to the troops, they had been overtaken by events and could not be executed. In what sense can Napoleon be said to have conducted the battle, Tolstoy asks? In what sense can he be called a military genius when he didn't know what was happening and his orders were ignored? But although he's arguing for Napoleon's irrelevance, Tolstoy often slips into lambasting Napoleon as evil and foolish, and at the same time he praises the wisdom of the Russian commander Kutuzov for biding his time and allowing the French army to exhaust itself. Well, it's rather strange to criticize Napoleon and praise Kutuzov when Tolstoy wants us to believe that these figures don't really affect anything very much. It suggests that although Tolstoy sees history as the swarm life of humanity, even he finds it difficult to write about the countless actions and decisions of the swarm. it's much easier to focus on a few highly visible figures who are perhaps representative of broader currents in human affairs. Let me give an example of what I mean. The Protestant Reformation is usually said to have begun with Martin Luther, when he published his 95 Theses criticising the Roman Catholic Church in 1517. But Luther was one of a long series of church critics. Why did Luther's protest catch on in the way it did? Was it really something special about Luther? Well, the world was changing very rapidly at that time with the invention of printing and improvements in navigation, for example. America had only recently been discovered, and trade with the Far East was increasingly important. There was a growing middle class. All these things made it more difficult for the church to retain its traditional hold on society and education. So people at that time were particularly ready to respond to Luther's call. When there's an important message to be transmitted, there has to be a sender, but it's equally crucial that the audience is tuned to the right channel. So Luther's prominence among a great number of reformers, such as Wycliffe, Huss, Calvin, was largely an accident of timing. If he'd made his protest in earlier periods, he would have probably been burnt at the stake, and we'd have heard a lot less of him. So the real drivers of the Reformation were the myriad actions and aspirations of people everywhere, not anything special about Luther himself. But when we talk about the Reformation, it's much easier and more memorable to talk about Luther pinning his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg than it is to talk about these complex processes of social change, of which I've only begun to scratch the surface. So Luther's importance gets exaggerated, and the same is true of these other great figures. Returning to Tolstoy, of course he takes an extreme view in order to make a point, but social theorists increasingly recognise that any theory of history has to allow both for the influence of individuals and the existence of broader processes of social change that shape and constrain what individuals can achieve. Great leaders are products of their time, and their followers have an active role in contributing to their ideas and putting them into practice. Human affairs cannot be steered like a ship. Otherwise, governments would always succeed in their promises and everything would be wonderful. In fact, events develop in unexpected ways, and great figures cannot necessarily produce the results they intended. But when we write about the past, it's easier to focus on a few outstanding figures, and they only seem so effective in shaping the course of history because we naturally focus on those aspects that are most relevant to the way things actually turned out.